Good morning, everyone. Hare Suanda, Cheryl Bearsley, Natle Weston, Damdenusli. My name is Cheryl Bear. I am from the beautiful village of Natle, which is located about an hour and a half west of Prince George in British Columbia. My people were formerly called the Carrier Nation, or Carriers, and that was because the French fur traders said that we were particularly good at carrying heavy loads for long distances. And I think that they were prophetic. We call ourselves Daket, which means the people who travel on the water. The word Natle, from Natle Watene, my community, it means the place where the salmon return. And we have about a 6-week window of the salmon run in which the whole community is really busy the whole time, getting ready for the winter. I would like to start off by also acknowledging the land that we're on, and the people whose land we're on, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississauga, the Credit, Anishinaabe, many Métis as well, and the Wendat, not too far away. This beautiful land, and that's what I wanted to reflect the scripture, the ancient paths. There are ancient pathways that I believe that the Lord remembers from the people who were placed, as our stories say, were placed on the land. And it's reflected in Acts, I think, 17. The land acknowledgement is so important to me as a first step, maybe a half step of reconciliation. In this journey towards reconciliation, it's these little changes that will help us to become a little bit more aware of just the place we're standing on. I tell the story about how when I was in grade 6, and so I'm 50 years old now, so this is going back a ways. When I was in grade 6, my teacher got up and said, okay, this section in socials, we're going to study Indians in Canada. And I was really excited, and I looked over at the only other Indigenous person in the classroom and was like, hey, cool. And immediately the teacher said, we're going to be studying from the East Coast, the Hurons. And then he said, and I think they might be extinct. And I was just so shocked as a little kid. I remember looking again at the other Native kid like, what? So I went from in a few seconds, virtually a few seconds, from being kind of like, hey, cool, like there's going to be some acknowledgement here. And I didn't have the words when I was a kid to understand what I was going through. I went from feeling a sense of maybe possible acknowledgement to a sense of complete invisibility and objectification. So I've since been to Wendake and other Huron communities, and we told that story with a little bit of sort of a sad chuckle and a lot of just sort of that just doesn't feel right. So when I hear a land acknowledgement, if I'm sitting in any kind of assembly and I hear someone from the front say, we'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people whose land we're upon, it makes me feel seen. It makes me feel like a human being. And so I really appreciate all of the efforts to do that. And as I said, that is maybe the first step in reconciliation. We still have a long journey ahead of us. It might take our entire lifetimes, and we might not even live to see the end of the journey of reconciliation for Canadian and Indigenous people in Canada. It's that there's that much to do. So I'm going to start with a prayer song, and this song doesn't have any translatable words. It's a chant, and people often ask me, what does it mean? What is the chant? And there's a little bit of sometimes a little bit of suspicion on the part of Christians about what's going on in this chant. And I assure you, it's mostly all good. Just the chant represents the deepest cry of our heart, as elders have told me. And they say to drum teams at powwows, they say, when you're going to sit at the drum, you have to first make sure that your heart is right. You can't have any anger or jealousy or sadness. You can't carry that in you. You have to lift it, let it go while you're singing, because all of that you're feeling is going to come out, and it's going to affect all the people. And we tell our worship leaders that same thing. Let's pray and prepare our hearts so that we're cleansed, by Jesus, and so we can give all the best of ourselves. So we have those same kind of ideas. And the prayer song is something that happens all over the place. I was in a political position in my community in Natley for a few years, or for 2 terms. I was a counselor, like chief in council, and got to work with every level of government. And I remember being in meetings and being like, well, this person is kind of a big deal. Like, what's going to happen now? And they always acquiesce to having a local traditional elder come and give a welcome to the land and also pray. And I was always just kind of sitting there like, these politicians, they all talk about, separation of church and state, but when it comes to us and our ways, it's traditional to open in prayer. So we get to do this. I get to do this in schools where they say, we don't want any religion. And I say, well, it's not religion, but I can't be here if I can't pray because it's part of my culture. So they're like, okay, go ahead. So it's good. So this song is a prayer song. Amen. So I don't know if you noticed some of the pictures that were going by during announcements and different things, the beautiful Indigenous art. I don't know who the artists were. I didn't recognize any, but I think they were local and so beautiful, so grateful. I'm so grateful to see those things in church. As an Indigenous person, going to church most of my life, I became a Christian when I was 8, and I can tell you that every church that I've gone into, in most of my life even Native churches, there's almost nothing that will connect visually with my Native soul. I haven't seen artwork. I could probably, on my 2 hands, I can probably count the number of churches in my lifetime. I'm pretty old. So in my lifetime, those are the amount of churches that I've seen Native art sort of like portrayed there. So, and that's an interesting thing, because there is something called contextualization, which is and it's a missiological term where we talk about taking the gospel and placing it within the context of Indigenous people. And a lot of Indigenous theologians, missiologists, pastors, they'll say that this never really happened in Canada and the United States because the gospel was, way back in the day when, and there's something called the Doctrine of Discovery. You're going to have to Google that and read some more on that. But essentially, the Christian doctrine of discovery was something that the European monarchs gave to the explorers. They said, if you find land and you don't find a recognized monarch, then consider the land terra nullius, or terra nullis, which means the land is empty. And in the 1500s, they had debates as to whether or not indigenous people, when of course we had, after the arrival of Europeans, when we met them, when we discovered Columbus, and then they had debates about whether or not indigenous people here had a soul. And you can research all of that as well. And the reason for that was because if we did have a soul, the reason for the debates was if we did have a soul, then they were obligated to evangelize us, to send missionaries. But if we didn't have a soul, they could just exterminate us. So one pope said, yes, they have a soul, and settled the argument, and so the missionaries came. So instead of extermination, there became the policy of assimilation using the gospel. And that's when it started, way back in the day. And that's why you see in the residential schools, the policy of, it was never a policy of education. It was always a policy of assimilation. And in these schools, the church partnered with the government to do that. And rather than placing the gospel, which is the most beautiful story that I have ever heard, that Creator so loved us that he sent Jesus, that whoever believes in him would not die but would live forever. That story instead, not given as a gift to indigenous people, but it was used as a tool or a weapon of assimilation. We have our work cut out for us in this journey of reconciliation as Christians. There has been, and there is a reckoning because of that stuff. And there's so many people in Canada who I've met today even who say, you know what, I never knew. Really smart, good people, educated people in Canada had no idea. So I always say, well, the most gracious thing to say is, you don't know what you don't know. And I think, let's start from there. Once you see something that's kind of gone awry, we have a choice. We can either sort of let it go and say, somebody else can deal with that. Or we can do the right thing and say, I can't unsee this. I have to do the right thing now. What is that right thing? What are those next steps? And I think my being here is one of those, is an important step. I love saying the phrase, nothing about us without us. So if we're talking about Indigenous issues and all of that kind of stuff, we should have a Native person in the room because it's important. It changes. It's just like turning up the temperature a few degrees up, a few degrees down. You're either going to take your jacket off or you're going to put your jacket on. And I think that's how it is when a Native person is in the room. We're a little bit maybe more careful of what we're going to say, and we maybe learn a little bit from that, I think. I really appreciated seeing all the efforts and the missions efforts into the other countries to do with water. That it always blesses me. If we're helping other nations, wherever that may be, wherever God has called us to help nations to deal with poor drinking water, it's really important. And I think that also highlighting some of the issues here in Canada, when we talk about those kind of things, when you slip from other nations, and then we start talking about Canada and Indigenous communities and water issues, sometimes some people will change the lens that they view from. And other countries, in talking about drinking water, it's a church lens. And we're like, yes, God is calling us to that. When it comes to First Nations, sometimes we can take those glasses off and we put on our political lenses. And we can say, well, why don't they just move to Toronto? What's the deal? Like, why don't we? And that's not the answer. Land is so important to us, and as of 2016, there's 78 Indigenous communities who were on water advisories, including my own nation, Natlewaten. We were on a water advisory for a couple of years. Everybody was, drinking out of those water coolers and stuff. And my auntie, when they took the water advisory away, we had a few months of talking with the local government scientist person who did the testing. He came into the community, and he said, "Okay, the water is good now. You guys can drink it." And so my auntie, she said, "I don't know what I'm going to do because we're supposed to be drinking this water, but my dog won't drink the tap water. He just refuses to drink it." And I was a little surprised by that. So I didn't really know what was going on there. So these issues are really important to us as Indigenous people, and they're also a part of reconciliation. We have to do the tough stuff. We have to talk about our differences, because if we don't do that, we're never going to be able to talk about the things that if you talk about the ways that we're the same, then that's just easy. To me, that's not reconciliation. Or maybe it's, to steal a little bit from Bonhoeffer, maybe that's cheap reconciliation. And he said cheap grace. And I think that doing the tough work, finding out the ways that we're different, why is there a political lens that gets put on when we talk about Indigenous people? And I know it goes way back to that doctrine, Christian doctrine of discovery. It goes way back to those days, and it's in the foundation of Canada, are those differences. From those days, Indigenous people were written about by explorers, by different ones over the years, and still today we are portrayed in the media as either dumb or scary. So if you can portray people as dumb or scary, you can say, well, they're not using the land, they're against progress, so we can just take it. If we're scary, well, look what they did at Little Bighorn. That was terrifying. They need to be put in their place. And rather than look at title and rights and all those kind of things. So the way that we've been portrayed and stereotyped has been because Canada had a goal in mind. And it's also the reason that no Canadian, or hardly any Canadians, knew about the residential schools until 2008, which is shockingly not that far behind us. When I was a little girl growing up in BC, there was still a sign in Vanderhoof in the 70s that said, it was in a business in Vanderhoof, the closest town to my reserve, and it said, "No Indians allowed." And when I learned that, I was so shocked. I thought, that can't be in my lifetime. That's supposed to be in the Deep South in the 50s, not here. And one of the things that happened within all of those years of sort of like the misstep of the gospel, of giving the gospel, was also this misstep of contextualization, or the great lack of contextualization, was that the Indigenous belief or the Indigenous story was not listened to. It was assumed that everything about us was evil and wrong, and everything about us was suspicious at best. So when I was a teenager in church, I was approached by a church person who said to me, "Oh, you're wearing native earrings." And I had like beaded earrings, just kind of imagine the most typical sort of dangly beaded earrings. And this person said, "Oh, those are native earrings, aren't those?" And I was like, "Yes." And I was happy to be noticed, girl. And the person said, "Don't those have evil spirits?" And I was like, "I hope not. My auntie gave it to me." And just had no words I was a kid. And then another person, same church, came up to me and said, "You're native, right?" "Yes, I'm from Natlai." And then the answer, or the question was, "There's a lot of darkness in your community, isn't there?" And again, I was like, I wish I could go back into my teenage self and say, "Yes, at night." And I understand that they are coming from a place of that you don't know what you don't know. And those assumptions came from someplace way, way back in our history. And the stereotypes and the bias and the racism, it's sunk deep into the Canadian psyche to the point where we don't even question it anymore. And when things erupt in Canada, when the truth erupts, and I think it's the word apocalypse, isn't it? It means the revealing, and the revealing kind of the truth. And I think that's what's happened in Canada with Indigenous people. Just, we now know some of the most horrific crimes against children happened here in Canada. And people have said to me, and I've heard this in the news, of course, from a senator who said, "Well, when it comes to the residential schools, can we just focus on the good things that happen in residential school?" And you know how many kids were here that went down to Sunday school. Say we have 10 little kids here, and they went, just reminded me of a little rhyme that's inappropriate. You might have anyway. Say there's 10 little kids who are going downstairs, and they have a new Sunday school teacher. And of course, this person's been vetted. Everybody trusts this person. But then the kids come back, and 9.5 of them say, "That teacher did something bad to me. That teacher hurt me." And would we say to them, "Let's just focus on the good"? No, we wouldn't. We would say, it would be pitchforks and lanterns to go after justice because those babies were hurt, wouldn't we? And so for Indigenous people, the majority of little Native kids, now elders, experienced really horrible, horrible things. And the goal was never education. The goal was that they didn't learn really a whole lot of stuff. Nobody was told, "Hey, you should go to college. You're pretty sharp." No, a residential school student ever heard that. If you look at what they learned in school, they were essentially trained to be servants. Sewing, cleaning, cooking, all of that stuff. They spend most of their days cleaning. Anyway, to look at the good is not really an option. And to honor our stories, to ask Indigenous people, what is your concept of God? What is your concept of Creator? And again, I heard pushback in my lifetime. I remember somebody saying, "Gichi Manitou," which means the Great Spirit, is a Cree name for God. And there was pushback right away from a European Canadian pastor who said, "Nope, you can't say that. That's a false God." And just like that, just wiped away like any possibility of contextualization. So if you look at books like Brushko or The Peace Child, those kind of books where it talks about finding what Jesus was up to before you get there as a missionary, those things are completely overlooked in those kind of statements. I've since asked a lot of elders. I've traveled to a lot of different Indigenous communities and asked elders to tell me the name of the Creator, and it's usually a beautiful descriptive name. and to tell me a story of the Creator or a creation story. And sometimes they can't because the stories are long. Sometimes the stories take days to tell, which is really cool. And I wish I had those days. Some of the names for the Creator are Wakan Takan in the Lakota language, which means the great mystery. In my language, Daketh, the word translates into the being up on high. There are different words that translate in different communities that say that the Creator's name is the one who started everything, the one who made everything, the Great Spirit. And I've asked elders not only the names, but also trying to find out a story, because how do we know that our God is the one true God? And this is Systematic Theology, Doctrine Proper 101. How do we know our God is the one true God? Well, we look at the Bible, and systematically you can see through the Bible how God acts and who God is. We call this the attributes of God, the characteristics of God, personality traits. So God is love, God is just, God is good. Those things, God will never act outside of those attributes. And when we see something off, like Baal or Molech in the Old Testament, doing crazy things and asking crazy things of their people, like, for example, Abraham and Isaac, when in those days, child sacrifice was normal. So we read that and we go, how horrible that God says, go and sacrifice Isaac. That would have been normal. Abraham would have went, okay, this is what everybody else is doing. That was a normal religious act in that day. The shocking thing for Abraham and Isaac would have been when God says, stop, don't harm your son. That's God. That's where we see God as different. So Baal and Molech, those are examples of, we can see, okay, they're definitely not our God. So when it comes to indigenous view of the Creator, there's been a couple of examples where folks will talk about spirits, good spirits or bad spirits, spirits and things, and I tend to think those are more demon angel kind of stuff, but largely it's the Creator who is, as the Creator who starts everything, made everything, hears our prayer. We have cleansing ceremony to stand before the Creator, watches over us, cares for us. All of those beautiful things. It just sounds like a very Old Testament view of God. And I haven't found anything that, when you talk about the Creator, I haven't found anything that's like glaringly like, oh no, that's definitely a false God. I honestly haven't. But those questions were never asked, because the goal, again, there were lots of good folks who had good intentions, missionaries throughout history and all of that. But when you talk about it, when you look at it, and you'll see a thread that there is a policy of assimilation through absolutely everything. It's so disheartening for me as a teacher, an educator, a learner, and the research that I've done, the stuff I've been shown, the lectures I've heard, the Facebook notices that I get, all of those things, it's so disheartening. And I have, in my life, just fallen into despair with the overwhelming amount of research that talks about, from the very beginning of the arrival of Europeans, how there was a policy of assimilation, that thread through everything, and even in the churches. So to turn that around, and then to ask, what shall we do? Well, we have to learn and listen to Indigenous voices, first of all. And one of the things that I want to just kind of close with, and I'm going to close with a song, but my favorite name for the Creator is found in the Lakota. I remember my friend, the late Dr. Richard Twiss, used to always pray and say, Takanshala, and it means grandfather. And when I first heard this, I was like, oh, maybe this is one of those names we can't, because God has no grandchildren. And when Jesus said, when you pray, say our father. He didn't say our grandfather. But the more that I thought about that name, and the more that I thought about, okay, Daniel 9 talks about the Ancient One. God is the Ancient One. Please don't call your grandparents that. Don't advise it. But grandparents, as a parent, I remember really loving my kids, and Mama Bear, like, over my kids. But I remember my dad, in particular, really changed when, to have a good daddy, when I gave him his first grandson, he changed. And I was like, what's going on here? Who are you? Like, he became an incredibly good grandpa. And the things that I could never get away with, my sons were getting away with. Right? And I was like, who are you? And of course, my kid on the floor or in the field position, screaming and on the floor of IKEA, and just the shame as a parent and of like, I'm exhausted and all of those things. And the grandparents' ability to just say, Mama, just go have a coffee, go away, and then scoop up the baby. And it doesn't matter if that's a temper tantrum or hurt. It doesn't really matter. It's just, I just want you to be okay. That's an old love. That's an old love. It's perspective. When you become a grandparent, everything changes. That grandbaby becomes the most amazing human being. And as I've talked about this in churches, I've seen grandparents, men, women, tear thinking about their grandkids. Oh my goodness, I didn't understand that kind of love until I became a grandparent. Powerful. That's the love that God has for us. That old love. The love that has perspective. Another name that I really love for the Creator is a name that, and I've said I've been in church for a lot of years, and I always heard about the victorious Christ, and there's different beautiful names for Jesus, but I never could really relate to them. I was like, yeah, I've got too much crap going on in my life to really be able to relate to that victorious, overcoming Christ. And I think if we're honest, all of us can say that. There's maybe not a lot of stuff on the outside of your life, but on the inside of our life, and the inside of our mind, emotions, and all that, there's a lot of stuff going on. And so it wasn't until, I don't know when in my life, later on, far too late in my life, that somebody mentioned the name in Isaiah. That's the man of sorrows. And this name for Jesus became my favorite name. As soon as I heard it, it says, man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief. Jesus and grief are old friends. And again, that story that whoever believes in Jesus won't die. Death has stalked me my whole life. My earliest memories are standing around a grave, and it's not because we're so poor and living bad lives. It's because Indigenous people are connected to reserve after reserve after reserve. We have so many cousins and relatives. The good news of life, and the good news that the man of sorrows, that this song is called Heal Me, and it has a grief chant in it, Anana. And I think that when we cry this cry, and all of us experience grief and loss, every one of us have and we will. When we cry this cry of grief, it doesn't just come out of our mouth and fall to the ground, but the one who the Bible says collects our tears in a bottle, this one comes close to walk with us, to walk on this journey of reconciliation.